are much more exciting speakers than me, which will be lovely. So welcome to this joint event we're hosting alongside the Ford Foundation today. But I just wanted to kind of give you a quick overview of the Participatory Grantmaking community. It's a wonderful collection of individuals from all across the globe. Lots of us are involved in funding organisations, some of us from Participatory Grantmaking organisations, some of us from more traditional funding backgrounds, some of us not from funding backgrounds at all. But it's a lovely place to come together and look at how we can shift and change and challenge philanthropy across the entire sector and across a lot of different geographies. We are pretty much completely volunteer run. We have the wonderful Elena and Millie on the call who do some coordination support for us, but otherwise the community is run by people on their spare time outside of the day jobs. We're all very excited but very tired. You can look at all of our resources, our upcoming events, and join our community on our website, which is up on the screen now. We also have a Google group and a Slack community, so you can get involved in conversations with funders or those in the space whenever a question pops into your brain. And we host monthly learning sessions every first Tuesday of the month, and every first Thursday of the month we host a peer support session, and then we host sessions like this, which looks at particularly a deep dive on topics. We try to make all of our content accessible and open source, so you can find everything that we've done on our YouTube channel. So if you want to deep dive into some of the areas, or you're new to this topic, or you want to explore more, you can find it all there. We do centre community. As I said, we are volunteer run, we're all a bit tired. So we're actually taking some time off over the summer. So there'll be no peer support sessions in August. We're taking a little bit of a break. We want to centre both self-care, but also community care. So we will see you all ready and fresh-faced in September for our peer support sessions. I've gone through some of this, but we offer a huge range of kind of services and offers to anybody who's interested in learning more about participatory grant-making, or who is working in an organisation to try and shift power to communities. But because we're volunteer-led, we're always after support from you. So if you do want to get involved, help us blog, write, host, share, volunteer with the community, please do let us know. We do make sure that we pay all of our speakers for the wisdom that they bring to this community, and we do that through donations, grants. So if you're interested in supporting the community, either as an individual, so through our open funding programme, Open Collective, you can donate a tenner if you're here today and you've come along for free, or if you're interested from your organisation to pay something more, we're always happy to have those conversations, because it does allow us to keep the work going and make sure people are compensated. So that is a very, very quick overview of what is a wonderful, I mean, I'm slightly biased, but a wonderful space to be involved in. Everybody is very, very lovely. I've met some incredible friends and colleagues through this space. So please do get involved. I'm going to hand over to Shanice now, who's going to intro the important people on the call and get us stuck into some incredible deeper dives into the learning from Ford Foundation's grants.
Thanks so much, Hannah, and really just want to urge everyone to see if they can be involved within the community. It's a great community already established around participatory grant making. My name is Shanice London. I am currently a program assistant at Ford Foundation. Really was go ahead and able to fund these research projects. Chris Cardona, my other colleague working at Ford, sends his well wishes. He's under weather today, but sends his well wishes for the session. I want to go ahead and get started quickly with just a Mentimeter poll that I would appreciate everyone to go ahead and complete while I go ahead and read off the speakers for our today's panel. So I'm just going to put this in the chat. And while you complete that, I'll do a quick intro of everyone that we have here speaking. So first, I want to start with Melanie Kwanochu of the Disability Rights Fund and Disability Rights Advocacy Fund. International Grant-Making Collaboratives was really grounded upon the disability rights community motto of nothing about us without us. So that's really resulting in a participatory grant-making structure. So they did an internal review of the fund's nearly 15 years history outlining how the precipitation of persons with disabilities mattered, fostered learning and networks, and established trust and impacted funding. So we'll be hearing from Melanie later today. Next, we have Bart Vegtek from New England Grassroots Environmental Fund. The fund has been really deepening their comprehensive participatory decision-making process with frontline organizers, nonprofit colleagues, as well as funding partners. And Bart's really going to be able to discuss how this approach, including participatory grant making, has added value and promoted diversity, equity, and inclusion. Lastly, we have Elizabeth Dale of Seattle University and Katie Carter of Pride Foundation. And they will be discussing how Pride Foundation and LGBTQ plus Community Foundation is working across 5 Western US states, has shifted its grant making to both align with the organization's racial equity core, as well as including greater community participation, while setting funding priorities and making grant decisions. So we'll be hearing from them as well today. So that's a little quick bio from our speakers on our panel. I quickly just want to be able to go back to the poll just so we can see what the results came out to. So quickly, really quickly, while I copy this link and go ahead and share it. I'm going to share my screen quickly. So here we have the results. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger for everybody. So we have about a median here in between, and about majority of those on the folks on the call today are in the exploration phase of participatory grant making. But we also have some that are still trying to make the case, as well as their organization already being in the implementation phase. So just wanted to do that quick poll so that we can get an idea of how everybody's approaching participatory grant making already. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Melanie. I'll go ahead and pull up your slide.
And while you're doing that, Shanice, I just want to say thank you to you and Chris and the Ford Foundation, as well as Cindy Gibson, who I know is, I think, attending here as well, and Hannah and Helena for the invitation. We really appreciate the support that the Ford Foundation has provided in cultivating these conversations and helping us really dig into the DRF participatory grant making model, which, as I'll share in a little bit, turns out that participation, according to these findings, actually seeped into more than just our grant making structure. So let me go into DRF's quickly participatory grant making structure, and to acknowledge, that when DRF started out almost 15 years ago now, there wasn't a term called participatory grant making. And so I think Diana Samarison, who's also our founding executive director, is here, and to acknowledge that she really helped the organization and the board, also in a global advisory panel. Together, they formed something that, as Shanice had mentioned, really reflected the principles of the movement of the disability movement, which had been well underway before DRF came into existence. And just want to acknowledge that I think for many participatory grant makers and for many funders, oftentimes when they are looking to invest in a particular challenge, in something that is critical and important to them to think about supporting, there are already people working in that space, right? The people with the lived experience who go through and understand what it's like to live these challenges. And so one of the things I wanted to acknowledge was it wasn't as if DRF had to find a particular movement. The disability movement at an international level was already active, had already achieved monumental things with the passage of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and many national countries had active disability movements. And so when we talk about DRF, DRAF working with particular social movements, the movement actually is the one that in many ways founded DRF. DRF gave birth to it. And so half of our board members and one co-chair, it was built into the bylaws of DRF, DRAF, would always be persons with disabilities. And over time, the structure of the funds evolved so that a grant-making committee was established. And that grant-making committee made final decisions on funding. And the majority of those grant-making committee members are disability activists. And we've seen over time as well that even there's half of, so maybe not half, but a little less than half of our grant-making committee also includes donor representatives. And over time, we've even seen these donor representatives be persons with disabilities themselves. So our donors, as they've engaged with the movement, engaged with the funds, were on our grant-making committee, began to make choices themselves of either hiring persons with disabilities, or perhaps persons with disabilities were being more open about their disability status. And within our structure, the majority of our program staff are also persons with disabilities from our different target countries. So I think we even have Dwi Aryani, who's our regional head of programs. She started out as a program officer from Indonesia, but she's an amazing disability activist. I feel like we could have an entire webinar just on her and the pieces that she has cultivated the movement through. And some of the findings of the research, I'm gonna move into this quickly, found that the different ways in which persons with disabilities, whether they were on the board, on the grant-making committee, or staff as a program officer, really mattered both to our grantees and to different people who are part of the structure, right? So we did a number of interviews with grant-making committee members, both past and present, grantees from 3 different countries. We also interviewed boards and Diana and other people that were a part of the origins of the funds. And that piece of DRF, DRAF reflecting that nothing about us without us model was actually critical. And out of that, it helped to then foster trust, that grantees and the broader movement could trust DRF, DRAF more to be listening to what it was that activists at the national level wanted to move forward, to understand what a lived experience would look like, and to know even some of the challenges that grantees were facing and the things that they wanted to change to foster and further their rights. We also found through this research that participatory grant making and the broader participatory approach really fostered learning and expansion of networks. And so that specifically is talking about learning internally and learning among grantees and expansion of networks, not just of grantees and of grant making committee members, but of board members as well. There's a great quote. So early on in the days of DRF, DRAF, we heard about maybe a wider division between the donors that were intentionally brought into the room with the activists that were intentionally brought into the room within our grant making committee, within our advisory structures at the time. And someone remembers people eating lunch separately. But over the years, that same person noticed over time that people are now activists and representatives are eating lunch together. There are these really organic conversations happening about how to support each other, how to get more funds to particular movements, and even how to talk about things outside of DRF, DRAF and support other global initiatives. We also had a finding, and this is a piece that I'm happy to talk about more if it's of interest to the attendees here, about the methodological piece of, and this last bullet, our research found that the participatory grant making structure may have further diversified our grants portfolios. And that may is in there, and I'll talk about that this is the methodology side of things. I like to think about research and different types of inquiry where you're looking at a still pond And what you're researching is a rock that you drop in, and you're then trying to measure some of the ripple effects, right, that you may have put in. It's an oversimplification of the reality of life and the systems in which we all live in. But for this particular research, our participatory grant making structure is the rock. And some of the ripple effects that were further out were diversification of the grants portfolio movements. In previous evaluations, external evaluations, we found that DRF and DRF, the broader way that it is set up, has helped to diversify movements within national countries to increase the capacity of organizations of persons with disabilities and increase the capacity of individuals. And all of that helps to reach then persons with disabilities who are marginalized, even within their own communities, right? So just to acknowledge what probably all of us know, is that social movements themselves have hierarchies, even within movements that are pushing rights forward. And that's no different within the disability movement. And so as DRF made intentional efforts to reach organizations of persons with disabilities that represented even more marginalized persons with disabilities, that participatory grant-making structure, thinking about who was on our grant-making committee, thinking about who else could be reached, as our program officers were reaching out and looking for and listening to the movements at the national level. We had one interviewee say that who was on the grant-making committee, who was on the board, that did influence the sort of outreach that happened to diversify, to think about who could be a possible DRF grantee in the future. And so that aspect of who else is in the room and who else is making decisions actually did seem to influence different levels of our team and who we actually reached out to. So I'll end here just by saying one of the key takeaways that I would say from my perspective is to really think about as if people are mostly in the exploration stage, right? To think about the reflective tools and spaces that you can provide within your organization, the movements that you're looking to support, the persons with lived experience. How do you align the movement's key principles with the general structure of how you are making grants decisions, who you are reaching out to, and how then that's executed? So I will end there and look forward to a broader conversation.
Thank you so much, Melanie. Just to do the next, we're going to go ahead and move to Bart, and then we'll hear from Elizabeth and Katie, and then dive into some discussion.
Great. Thanks, Melanie. And echoing thanks to especially Shanice and Helena for all the back-end work in setting up this webinar, and the Ford Foundation for their support of this work. So a lot of what I think I will touch on really aligns with what Melanie just shared. I'll give a little bit more specifics on the grassroots funds, which I represent. And then I think I've really appreciated having space with Katie, Elizabeth, and Melanie as well ahead of this webinar and as part of the Ford Foundation work to just see how much alignment there is around some of the key takeaways, as well as some of the challenges that I think I heard Melanie already talk about around that concept of, well, it may have influenced, and how do you really ground some of those takeaways, especially in our case, as an organization that is still actively evolving its participatory process, even after 26 years, which means continually being very flexible and ensuring that we keep making changes as we get feedback from the folks that are participating in our process. So, at a larger level, the New England Grassroots Environment Fund operates in the northeastern part of the United States, the 6 states that collectively make up what is called New England. They are the states of Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Organization has been around for 26 years and was originally created after about a year-long research project where consultants, researchers went out to various focus groups, had conversations with government representatives, nonprofits, as well as volunteer organizations to kind of hear what was going on in the environmental movement, and learned that there is a layer of tremendous activity, creativity, innovation at the very hyper-local level in neighborhoods, in rural communities, in urban areas. But that philanthropy wasn't getting any dollars to these organizations because in the United States, oftentimes foundations require 501c3s or a fiscal sponsor in order to get dollars to these groups. And a misconception that that is a requirement from the IRS in order to be able to give grants. So the Grassroots Fund was created in order to get more dollars to that particular area of activity, volunteer efforts that are representing their communities that have what we call lived experience of dealing with the impacts and often have direct solutions for what's going on in their community and how do we get more dollars to those particular groups. So from the get-go, we were created as, I don't think, as Melanie said, we weren't calling it participatory grant-making at the time, but we were set up as an organization that would always work with a grant-making committee. And the bylaws also stipulate that our board will always have a combination of funders as well as grassroots organizers, with grassroots organizers always making up more than half of our board from the get-go. For about 20 years of the 26 years that we've been doing this, our process had staff invite grant-making members onto the committee, which was highly reliant or dependent on the connections and the relationships that staff held. And about 6 years ago, as an organization, we really took a step back and evaluated, again, our founding documents, what were the original intent behind creation of the Grassroots Fund, and really leaned in more into environmental justice principles and what that would mean. And I think that really resonates with what Melanie just shared, the movement that you're a part of. What are some of the grounding principles and how is that impacting how we are doing the work? And what can we learn from some of those principles that the movement is putting forward in order to live into some of those? Out of all of that work came what we now call our guiding practices. Originally called them values, that felt too static. So we're really talking about practices. How are we making some of these values come alive, both for ourselves as an organization, as well as for the groups that are applying to the Grassroots Fund? How is our application form also a tool for that kind of reflection as well? Again, for ourselves as an organization, for people participating, and for folks receiving funding, to think about these practices, which for us are, how is the work rooted in the community? Which has everything to do with the environmental justice principle of centering the voices of those most impacted. How are we really thinking about shifting power in decision-making and work towards shared community leadership? What does that look like? Not just as a value, not as a theory, but in practice. What can people name as specific practices of how they are doing the work as they apply to us? And how can we as an organization name how we are centering shared community leadership? What is that looking like? How do we lower barriers to participation so that everybody can join and it truly is bottom-up organizing? And then the last guiding practice we have is around centering just transition. So how are we looking at the intersection of a variety of movements and ensure that the work that is called environmental work, environmental justice work, really includes economic impacts, social impacts, racial equity? How do we have conversations and co-create those kinds of projects together? For us, that has meant some pretty significant changes in our participatory approach. So we no longer directly invite just as staff, and we've the people that are participating on our grant making committee, but we have two phases now. The first phase of our review invites readers, and that is an open call. So anybody interested in participating in our process is welcome to join us as a reader. Readers do their work online. They have a 3-week period to review any applications and use the rubric. And there's a fairly light training at that point. We do a webinar. In that webinar, we talk about bias in decision-making, and we talk about what our guiding practices are rooted in. But there's not a deep expectation of people, everybody fully being in a certain place around some of those concepts. And that reader phase is really much more about the readers necessarily than it is about grantees or applicants and feedback at that point. It is a tool for us as staff to get to build new relationships with folks that want to participate. So diversifying how many folks are participating in our process, not having that rely on us as staff and the relationships that we hold. But it's an opportunity for readers to also really practice their own recognition of some of these core values, these core principles, and reflect themselves on how this is showing up in their own work and what they're seeing in some of the applications that they are reading as they are coming in. Then we have a phase where we as staff call every applicant, mostly because we work with all volunteer groups who are really new to fundraising and applying for grant funding. Oftentimes those phone calls unearth new information or add some clarity. Most of our readers ask questions. What wasn't clear in the application? Where do we need to dig a little deeper with folks on the phone? And that leads to the final phase where a grant making committee looks at staff input from those phone calls, as well as the reader input, the reader comments, the reader questions that were raised. That grant making committee is comprised 100% of grassroots organizers that are doing work that's really closely aligned with our guiding practices. So practitioners that are doing work on the ground, that are working at the intersection of environment, social justice, economic justice, and that are really centering all of our guiding practices as well in their work. They make final decisions. Our board does set a budget for each grant round, but it's that grant making committee that decides how funds are distributed. Another big change that we made with our grant making committee is that we have a longer retreat now, where we have folks together for a number of days. That's been very virtual over the last couple of years for obvious reasons. But we do a number of trainings focused on bias in decision-making, as well as how do we as a group come to agreement with each other when we all bring in a diverse set of lived experiences. Everybody that signs up, whether or not you're a reader or a grant-making committee member, we ask folks to self-identify across a range of key demographic characteristics to understand what kind of perspectives we are bringing into the room, and to also have a mirror for ourselves as an organization, whether or not we are bringing in a broad range of lived experience as we make decisions. That's used by a committee that helps decide who finally joins our grant making committee as well. And it's really then being able to talk about, as we bring in all those diverse lived experiences, how is their language, shared language around bias in decision making, which has been really key. When people do disagree, how do we name that? How does that not become personal? How does that become much more a space where we can name, okay, I think I see a confirmation bias, or the anchoring effect, or one of the other biases that we've identified that I'm blanking on right now, but I'm happy to find. And then we really talk about what does it mean to lean into what we call consent decision-making. That is the decision-making approach that we often rely on. How is that different from consensus decision-making? How is that different from majority voting? How does that align with some of our values? And what do people need to learn ahead of making sure that we enter that space when we make final decisions in a way where people feel prepared? And that's some of the biggest feedback that we're getting for folks, is that this is a space of practicing some of those ways of showing up, of making group agreements in ways that then start showing up in their own work, as well as people return to their own spaces. So don't want to take too much more time, but the key finding, I think, is really aligned with what Melanie already said. We are also seeing that because of our open call, we are expanding our network. We are hearing from more folks, mostly because it's not just staff inviting. It's one thing for me as a representative of the Grassroots Fund to say, hey, I think you should participate, or hey, I think you should even apply for funding. Some of our readers are really becoming ambassadors. Actually, most of our readers are becoming ambassadors back in their own communities for our grant programs, as well as the opportunities to become readers. And that's really expanding who is recognizing themselves in the Grassroots Fund. A lot of folks that have recently applied, often said, we heard about you, but we weren't an environmental funder. We don't consider ourselves an environmental activist. So we never thought that we would be eligible for funding, but it's often readers that have convinced folks that, like, no, you should give that a try. There's a process here. And that's really contributed to who's in our network and who considers themselves part of this work. And then all of the spaces we're creating, and the training and the conversations we're having around how do we get to group agreements? What does consent decision-making look like? How does bias show up in decision-making? Is having a big impact around some of the shared learning. We are finding we need to build out our capacity in order to track that learning, which comes back to what Melanie was saying as well. How do we build a better infrastructure around getting from the it may have impacted to really a deeper understanding of exactly how that works. And I'll leave it there and pass it over to Katie.
Thanks, thank you all. I want to echo the gratitude for Shanice and Helena for putting this event together, and for all of you for being here. And big gratitude to Bart and Melanie for the brilliance that you're bringing into this space, and the Ford Foundation for creating this space together. I am Katie Carter. I am the CEO at Pride Foundation. Pride Foundation is an LGBTQ community foundation. We are based in the Northwest, so we serve Oregon, Washington, Montana, Idaho, and Alaska. We were actually founded in 1985, so we've been around for 37 years. And we were founded by LGBTQ activists at the time, particularly in the midst of the HIV and AIDS crisis, as a foundation to be both a place where folks could put their resources as folks were dying, as well as to invest their resources that had while they were living back into LGBTQ communities at a time when we were seeing a burgeoning of movement of groups and organizations being founded and being created in the broader movement for LGBTQ rights. So that's sort of the history of where we come from, and our board and staff is entirely comprised of LGBTQ people from across the geographic areas that we live and from across sort of the different identities that LGBTQ people hold, in addition to our sexual orientation and gender identity. And so we got involved in this process from a slightly different vantage point than some of the other groups. And I want to shout out Elizabeth Dale, who has been working with us as sort of a case study researcher to be able to sort of document the process that we've been going through as a foundation over the past couple of years as we looked at our grant making model and thought about the shifts that we were making. Without getting too into the weeds about our history, but we've actually gone through many different iterations of grant making and historically have had a fully participatory grant making model, and over the course of the past 37 years had sort of evolved to having a more traditional philanthropic model where we had sort of program officers in each of the states that we serve, but their roles were really multifaceted, and they looked a lot less like program officers. That's actually the role that I started in at Pride Foundation, and a lot more like community builders and organizers and relationship builders with groups and organizations across the region that we support. One of the things that I should mention too is we're the only funder in our region that is dedicated to supporting and funding LGBTQ communities primarily, and one of the biggest funders in our region, despite the fact that our overall grant making is relatively modest. So we're also, part of our work as a foundation is not just to fund groups and organizations, but also to find those groups and organizations and help get them more connected within the philanthropic space to help them be better resourced, because as we all know, like many other groups that have been intentionally marginalized, LGBTQ people and groups and organizations receive very, very little philanthropic support and funding. So that's part of the space in which we're working as well. But getting back to our grant making, we as an organization have been sort of evolving and looking at our grant making structure and always trying to figure out the ways that we could make it more equitable, the ways that we could make it more aligned with our values as a foundation to really center those who are most impacted by the pains of injustice within the work that we're doing. And in 2017, we made a commitment as an organization to center racial equity within the context of LGBTQ justice and within the work that we were doing. And part of that shift was to look toward our grant making models to see if there were ways where we could do more power shifting and power sharing that would enable the communities that we were prioritizing, particularly BIPOC communities, rural communities, elders, young people, to be more centered within our grant making. And so that was where we really looked at the model that we currently had and thought that we could be moving more into a place of moving back to a participatory grant making model. And I will name that a big part of our story within this is that the bulk of this work was slated to move toward that grant making model was slated to happen in 2020. So we started at the very end of 2019, early 2020. We had hired a new director of programs who was really going to be tasked with implementing this big shift in our grant making and began the work. And then the pandemic hit. and our best laid plans had to be changed. And we were really faced in that moment with thinking about whether we kept going with the intentions that we had, knowing the time and the capacity that it would take to move to a participatory model, or we could be adaptive and responsive to what community groups and organizations were needing and asking of us, knowing that we were going to be one of the only foundations who was intentionally focused on LGBTQ communities. And so we chose to be adaptive and responsive, and ultimately chose a different path than participatory grant making for a number of reasons that I can share a little bit more about. At the same time that we were thinking about a participatory model, we were doing a lot of deep work as an organization within thinking about trust-based frameworks of doing philanthropy. And the way that we had already been operating was sort of in this vein, similarly to what Bart and Melanie named before we knew it was called trust-based philanthropy. This was sort of the model and the framework that we had been utilizing. And we began, as the pandemic started, thinking about the ways that we could apply all of those principles to the way that we did crisis funding in those early months. So we started a crisis community, what we call the Crisis Community Care Fund. We had one-on-one conversations with groups and organizations to just get a better sense of what everybody was facing, how we could be support, what they needed beyond finances. And we ended up sort of creating a model where we proactively moved funding to organizations without asking them to, do another application after we had already had these conversations, and there were surveys and all the things that you might remember from those early days of the pandemic as foundations trying to figure out how the best way we could respond. But we had deep relationships with the groups across the region that we had been funding, many of them for many, many years. And so we started moving resources proactively as we were able to raise them to groups and organizations. And what we really learned through that process and the feedback that we got from groups is that there was a lot of trust that actually got built from that model of just moving resources, no strings attached, no reporting, no application, based on the conversations and the needs that groups had said. And so the feedback we got is like, thank you. This is what we've needed. This is what we were hoping to be able to share. And so really where we ended up as 2021 started, and we were thinking about whether we could go back to a participatory model, we got stuck in thinking that what the way that we had been funding was met with a lot of encouragement from organizations. We had received a lot of feedback around the prioritization that we had made, and that the way we were doing our funding was what our community and what the organizations and groups that were set up to support needed and wanted from us. I think one of the other things that I didn't mention is, especially during 2020, as we were trying to figure out how to implement and create a participatory model, the staffing time for Pride Foundation and the structure that we had was not actually set up to do that. And so a big part of our learning in this process was that we needed to think about the ways that our staffing structure would facilitate a participatory model, which resulted in an entire organizational restructure that we did throughout the course of the past couple of years. So that is one of our big learnings from how to move to a participatory model, is that you need the staffing structure in place and the skill sets in place within those staff to be able to really focus on the work that we were trying to do. Additionally, the feedback that we got from community members over 2020 and into 2021 is that they were at capacity and were not, in a place where they wanted to really participate in a participatory grant making model, even if there was compensation and other things like that. I'm sure we can all relate to the fact that we've been tired for a couple of years, and that was not exactly the places that we could especially focus. So we really spent a lot of time just thinking about what would be the best way of doing our grant making. And one of the things is that we actually decentered the grant making process, right? The applying, the reporting, and the feedback that we got from organizations is that that enabled them to focus on their work more. And so where we're really at right now is exploring how we can continue to build out these trust-based practices, where we can continue to do low barrier, proactive grant making that enables groups and organizations to focus on their work, while also making sure that the grant making that we're doing is, really focused on what community groups and organizations are telling us that they want, being responsive to the shifts that they're asking us, but also still trying to figure out how we can do some kind of participatory model in thinking about the new ways that we have resources. And the final thing I will say too is that one of the barriers that we ran into within our participatory model is that our funding is made up of a lot of different area of interest funds for a public foundation. All of it isn't unrestricted. And so we had to be able to think about how that would really put strings on a group of advisory members who were looking at our grant making and saying, oh, some of it has to be go to this and some of it has to go to this. It doesn't really enable those decisions to be fully within those groups and organizations. So one of the things we've been working on over the past couple of years is getting a bigger pool of unrestricted funding that would enable a participatory model to be actually fully decided by community members and organizations. So I'll stop there. Lots more to share there, but really we have been in a deep learning process and trying to be adaptive and responsive. And I think our biggest lesson is that sometimes the best laid plans and the intention of what you have to do is not actually what the circumstances are going to allow or require, and that listening to community is the most important thing that we could do throughout this process.
Thank you so much, Katie, Elizabeth, Melanie, Bart, just for sharing what each of your organizations are doing. We had some discussion questions, but I think it's really important to get to the Q&A that's happening live. So I feel like we'll just dedicate the rest of our time together. We have about 16 minutes left, just to really making sure that we're addressing as many questions as possible. So we have a couple already in the queue, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. Just to start out, some questions that we received before. And feel free anyone to jump in as a response on how was the attribution decided, and i.e. how the impact of the participatory practices was identified versus wider factors which may have had an impact on the movements, as well as just how coming about the definition of a community movement, and curious on how a community movement may differ from community organizing. So just to start out, we can start out with that question if anyone feels free to respond.
This is Melanie. Shanice, I can take that question around attribution. I think it's a fun one for me because it's actually rather technical. I think if you look at it from like a research and evaluation perspective. So I'm just going to start, since I feel like this community, we can do this just by deconstructing that word attribution and where that comes from. Right? And so attribution tends to take a look at one actor's influence on a much broader system. And we like to think more at DRF about contribution. Again, acknowledging that these movements had existed prior to, that the movements were working and experiencing and pursuing their own rights prior to DRF existing. And so we think about contribution as a better alignment with the rights and justice-based principles of, I think, broader participatory grant making and DRF, right? So just that small caveat on the use of that word, and even about thinking about impact and how we even define impact. So for us, in terms of our methodology, it was really critical for us to think about looking at a broader set of factors in addition to the grant making participatory model. And so we set up, actually, Hannah was a part of our research board, as was Diana and other previous staff, our previous program director, and a board member and grant making committee member, most of whom are persons with disabilities, help us to define our research questions and think about how did we define impact and what did we want to inquire in this research project? What questions were we actually going to ask? And that helped us, I think, shift this power piece again, which participatory grant making is about who decides where the impact came from and who decides what are the relevant questions to ask. And so, for us, there were a lot of positive factors that came out of the participatory grant making. Maybe one of the things that I'll highlight is this unmeasured and in some ways unseen, but very often expressed to us, effect of when people who have traditionally been marginalized and ignored are listened to and are involved in decisions that affect their own lives, that maybe also affect their peers, that affect their family members. There's something really significant that changes in the disability movement. People talk about moving away from a charity model to a rights-based model. And so these rights need to be fulfilled, not because of pity, as the charity model tends to sort of pull out on our emotions, but on the fact that this is the right and moral thing to do. And people, these are their inborn and their rights, right? Unalienable rights. And so I think I'll end there and see if Bart or Katie have anything else to add.
No, I really appreciate that, Melanie, especially that shift away from charity towards rights-based and what that really means. That's something that we talk about internally a lot as well. And around the movement question, we saw some of these questions, and I know there's some alignment across us in terms of how we think about this. For us at the Grassroots Fund, it was tremendously helpful to really start using specific language around environmental justice. That's not a movement we've invented at all. That's been around for a long time. And that's probably true for a lot of the work that funders seek to support, that there's already people doing that kind of work. And those people are defining what their movement is and who is in their movement. And often that's really, really expansive. We haven't found a need to really define it for ourselves. Sometimes I think what I understand in some conversations with funding partners, that can be helpful just to kind of limit well, who do we fund, who do we not fund, and how do we just provide a lot of clarity in order to limit how many folks are going to be applying for funding for us if we're going to make it really, really open. And at the same time, in our case with environmental justice, there's so much intersectionality around these issues. Food insecurity isn't just about the availability of food, it's economic justice. It's around housing rights. It stretches into so many different movements, disability rights movements, LGBTQ organizing. All of this has to be at the table if we're going to come up with resilient solutions. So for us, it's a lot less around how do we as the Grassroots Fund define a movement, but how do we work with folks on the ground that have already identified movements and know how to intersect. Katie, Melanie, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but that's often how we navigate that movement question.
I would just underscore it's really similar to Bart, what you've shared, and Melanie, what you've shared. We don't intentionally define movement, and I think obviously we're funding in the LGBTQ plus space, but also a lot of the work that we fund is around direct service, or what looks like direct service, right? Like especially around queer youth who are needing places to gather, to connect, and in many ways that could be considered movement building. Many of them consider it part of that movement, right? And I think especially for groups that don't have access to services from mainstream providers, that those spaces where services are accessed become points of movement, points of leadership. And so I think it's really important for us to keep a broad definition of what movement means and looks like, and be able to also understand what are the conditions that make movement possible, and make sure that we're funding at those spaces as well.
Absolutely. I'm getting some kind of cluster some of the questions. We're getting a lot of questions around bias. So just if it's just any input around any trainings around on bias in decision making, or what biases you may have been seeing in the decision making. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in there, Shanisa. Put some of the biases that we talk about in our trainings in the chat, but I'll repeat them here. We talk a lot about adultism. We have a young leaders grant program where we really center adultism. And I think we spend a lot of time how any of us often develop a lot of our biases as young people, how that is reinforced. It's always shocking having young kids. There's this one slide where we have a number of statements like finish your plate and because I say so, and how do we sort of reinforce some of these power dynamics from a really early age? And as a parent, how am I reinforcing that with my own kiddos? So that's a big piece. We talk about the backfire effect, the anchoring effect, survivorship bias, confirmation bias, and the blank spot bias, which is by no means an exhaustive list of like, these are just the biases that show up, but they give us context. And again, what it comes down to for us is a lot less about naming the exact biases. It's more offering folks language to explore what is happening as we're having conversations with each other. And we do see that in practice in these groups as people start talking with each other about specific applications. And somebody may just be stuck, like, I just don't see why we should fund XYZ effort. How is that part of, how is that environmental is often a word or a sentence that we hear a lot in our grant making committee spaces. And it's useful for folks to actually be able to say, well, maybe that's survivorship bias, or maybe that's confirmation. It becomes a lot less about the individual and much more about a broader dynamic that we can unpack a little bit more and have constructive conversations around. And then in the end, what the other thing I will say, which again, I put in the chat as well, we really talk a lot about how white supremacy culture reinforces a lot of these biases for us. So what is the intersection of white supremacy culture and bias in decision-making? And then how do we talk about disrupting some of that? What does that look like or sound like in some of these spaces? Again, not as an exhaustive approach, but how do we just offer folks tools to engage with each other in a different way and create some shared language around that?
I'll just jump in here to add to the question on bias. Really having clear priorities for funding is something that I think the Pride Foundation was able to create with their community of grantees, and that to have clearly stated priorities, whether including on the website, but also as a guide for those making funding decisions in whatever format, kind of serve to anchor those values, anchor those priorities, and counteract bias. And for Pride Foundation, a lot of the priorities are really about centering BIPOC, LGBTQ organizations, individuals, trans individuals. And so stating that up front, I think also matters.
Giving some time if anybody wanted to jump in, but I do think I'm seeing some, this may have been addressed in the chat or within the presentations, but just to make sure that we address it, any type of recommendations about training and guidance that you are providing your grant making communities when they are reviewing applications and award funds. And then also related to that, is there any type of filtering that you may have been doing based on the reading staff review level, or does the community, or does your committee kind of all see the applications that come in? So that's kind of a twofer. Anybody wanted to jump in on that?
Well, this is Melanie. I think that training and guidance question popped up as I was speaking, so I'm happy to address some of that. So we have moved to a fancy new online review portal. And so, but even prior to that, when it was all Word and PDF documents, the team and the staff thought it was very critical to ensure that it may not be training on how to review a grant recommendation memo, which our grant making committee does and looks at all of them and reviews them and votes on each individual one or puts forward questions that they may have on different grant recommendations. But it was also this making sure that they were all accessible. Right. And so did some members of our grant making committee need additional time to review these grant rec memos? Or a wonderful member of our team, Carrie Thompson, who's been with the fund since the very beginning, and she was the first person Diana hired, would sit down with maybe a grant making committee member or two to talk through the content of the memos and to ensure that there was space and time. And to kind of get, I think that what it also allowed us to do over time, and things and processes have shifted and changed over the 15 years, is to think about how that voting process was done. Did everybody need to speak up in a crowded room like this? Did everybody want to speak up in a crowded room like this? Was this the best way for our, people's brains to process or to talk through their questions? And so at one point, a survey was sent out where people could ask their questions. They didn't have to raise their hand in the moment and ask the question, but they could think about it, process it, provide their feedback in a way that felt more accessible to them, allowed, I think, for some more flexibility of time as well, as we sort of think about the investment that our grant making committee members are making. Granted, they do get honorariums and we do compensate people for their time. They are still putting an enormous amount of their expertise into the review. They're disability activists themselves and understand what they are for the most part, what they're voting on, and still ask insightful questions about the context of that particular proposed project and what that's looking like. So I hope that answers a bit of that question. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I see we're almost running out of time. Any additional questions, we'll definitely still please put in the chat. We'll be able to bring it to our speakers and give you a synopsis, and everyone put their input so you at least get the answers to your question. I do want to pass it to Hannah for any closing remarks just before we close out today's session.
Just thank you so much. It's been such a rich and insightful conversation to all of our speakers, but also Shanice and Chris from Ford Foundation for doing a lot of the organising work, and Elena and Millie from the Participatory Grantmaking community, who have done all of the tech and they're helping us herd cats. I'm sorry, because I am definitely one of those cats. So thank you so much, everybody. It's been so wonderful to see you all. Enjoy the rest of the day, whatever time it is with you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for coming. I want to thank all of our panelists, Katie, Elizabeth, Bart, Melanie, for joining us today and giving your insights. We will be able to give a recap of the recording, as well as the slides, as well as any additional questions. So thank you again so much, and have a good night, good afternoon, rest of your day.